All right, well, I'll go ahead and let's get started. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. If you don't mind, if you haven't already, just make sure that you're muted so that we don't, out of respect for our speaker, and we don't interrupt her presentation. This session is being recorded and will be available on stopRED.org next week, along with all of the other past sessions that you're welcome to view as well. At the end of the session, please take the 2-minute survey so we can continue to improve and get funding for these trainings. I also want to thank our funding stream. Funds are made available for this project through the Missouri Department of Public Safety and the Missouri Juvenile Justice Advisory Group from funding provided by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Simmons.
Good morning to everyone, and welcome to the Missouri Juvenile Justice Association Lunchtime Learning provided by the stopRED Racial Ethnic Disparities Division of MJJA. We're excited today to have Dr. Brandy Peoples. She's someone we have borrowed again from the St. Louis County Courts, family courts. We have been looking at some areas of mental health, cognitive disorders with our juveniles, and particularly those of color. And so we're glad to have specialists to come in to assist us in that area. Dr. Brandy is a licensed psychologist and an ordained minister and has a passion about destigmatizing mental health and preaching the word of God. As she destigmatizes mental health, she looks at some of the myths in our community that have had many people of color at distance to mental health. And so we are great to have her expertise here today. And many of you know that some of the recent efforts of MJJA RED's division includes juvenile trauma and looking at the possible contributing factors to that. We are a part of listening and learning from the national conversation that talks about trauma as a possible cause for learning disabilities, cognitive disorders, misbehavior of our youth. And at the end of this presentation, we will post in the chat box 3 of the books that may assist you that MJJ has promoted 2 of, through one by way of the Mental Health Association. So without further ado, I'm excited to bring you this outstanding woman and lover of our community and our children, Dr. Brandy Peoples.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, for this invitation to really talk more about what I do and talk more in depth about the community that I serve. I think it's appropriate, Dr. Simmons, to just give you a little bit of a background of my role as a psychologist here with Family Court of St. Louis County. So essentially in my role, I do psychological assessments that are forensic, of course, for juvenile offenders, youth who have committed crimes. Now, with that being said, in my assessments, I am looking for mental health diagnoses and also coming up with potential treatment recommendations and solutions that play a part in their ultimate decisions that are made regarding whether that's going back home, going back to a group home, and what have you. So with that being said, and I know we're here to talk about trauma, right? So I can just kind of speak personally. I've been doing this work for about 7 years. And what I've discovered is in my assessments and talking to these youth, they have experienced quite a bit of trauma. Now, I also have a background at the VA. And ultimately, I think when we think about trauma, we think about it as being something that we've experienced maybe through war, natural disasters, that ultimately lead to a diagnosis of a PTSD, right? And working with these adolescents, what I've discovered is community violence. They've experienced quite a bit of community violence, quite a bit of traumatic grief from the fatal loss of friends and other loved ones that have impacted them on a biological level, mental, emotional level, but also as well as a spiritual level. So kind of keeping with that same flow, and what I mean by that, if you would allow me, and a lot of this information, if you all are interested, you can go to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's a great resource. They detail various forms of trauma in addition to providing brochures and other learning materials for support. So essentially what I mean by that, the different levels in which trauma can impact a child. The biological level. What we know is that when a person has experienced trauma, especially in a developmental age, that affects your brain development. Things are underdeveloped. And when your brain is underdeveloped, that in turn affects your functioning. So things like impulse control, things like higher order decisions, things like decision making, that can be interrupted and brought and delayed by trauma. Now, these are kids in school having problems with impulse control, having problems with decision making, having problems that ultimately can impact their schooling, their academics, their grades. So that's the first piece. And with that being said, sometimes kids end up being misdiagnosed with ADHD, when in turn it could potentially be a traumatic event that is causing about and bringing about these behavioral changes. So that's the first piece. The psychological level, the emotional piece. I say that trauma can be numbing. Trauma can interrupt your attachments to family, to friends. Trauma can kind of leave you in this place where you can't emotionally or mentally move forward. So these same children who've experienced community violence, they're also having problems with their social interactions because of the trauma that they've experienced. So that's the other piece. And as you said, Dr. Simmons, I do have the background in spirituality. And then the other piece that I'll throw into that is trauma for some people, and I'm not just talking about kids, adults as well, brings about a moral dilemma. You question your beliefs, your value system. Like I said before, I've worked in the VA and I've seen individuals who have been traumatized and they are completely nihilistic, completely pessimistic. That's one end of the spectrum. But then on the other end, they have been able to conceptualize their trauma within the context of, there's still a loving God, a higher power. I can get through this. So what I've seen with spirituality, that can be a protective buffer that can help heal or it could hinder. So that's just like my complete summary of how trauma can impact the whole person. And when I think of myself as a psychologist, I think of myself as a total healer because I'm very, very concerned about the spiritual piece as well as the physical piece, the emotional as well as the mental.
I was just wondering about the generational trauma.
Mhm.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? I think you talked about the environmental, the community um, events that take place and looking at some of the events that have taken place currently that
Absolutely,
the
absolutely.
average juvenile would have experienced nationally too.
Absolutely. So, in working with majority African American youth, and what I found just in the community, right, there's this kind of saying, and some of you may be familiar with it. What goes on in this house stays on in this house. So, with that being said, when you grow up with that saying, with that statement, when you've experienced trauma, the trauma goes on in the house and the effects of the trauma stays in the house. So there is no treatment. So it ends up becoming a cycle. And I can go a little bit more into this. In working with the kids, and I'm doing my assessments, I'm asking really detailed and thorough questions. I'm looking at cases, I'm looking at reports, and I'm not surprised when I see that the parents have also been traumatized. The parents have had dysfunctional backgrounds. The parents have also been exposed to community violence. And then in turn, their children are experiencing some of those same things. All that tells me is that this is a cycle. And if you don't interrupt the cycle, it continues. In working with these families, I find myself almost always having to explain what trauma is. And I think we talked about this informally a couple of days back, Dr. Simmons, when I said, I talk about trauma, and in turn, parents say, and even kids, well, that's just everyday life. That's just what you got to do to make it. So they have numbed themselves, and this has become a part of their life. This has become survival. So if you don't realize that this is trauma, that this is dysfunctional, that this is unhealthy, you end up continuing the cycle, which becomes consistent, persistent, and in some type and intergenerational. They don't recognize that this is not how life is meant to be until we have clinicians, and I almost say healers, come in to say that's not normal. Or do you realize what you were exposed to has impacted you? Like I said before earlier, when you experience trauma, this might be a one-time event, meaning acute, or it could be chronic and multi-layered, which is complex trauma. And I think that's another term that's being thrown out there lately. Most of the families that we serve have endured and experienced complex traumas throughout the generations. And like we established earlier, that has an impact on your biopsychosocial functioning. So biologically, something's different. So that parent that has experienced trauma, biologically, something's different. Social and emotionally, something is different. And then they in turn parent children under stress, under duress, under depression, under anxiety, under extreme bouts of anger. That in turn affects the child. And then we see the child acting out and behaving in ways that's in response to what they've experienced in the home and ultimately in their community. So that's the family system of trauma. And like I said before, specifically talking about African Americans, going back to that original statement, what goes on in this house stays in this house. And then I'll also throw in the other piece of therapy and mental health. There's a stigma around it, where we in the past have not had the luxury of being able to afford mental health services. But then also things like, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't need no doctor. I don't need nobody to talk to. Okay. And then that type of thought process leads you deeper and deeper and deeper into the cycle of trauma. So me as a change agent, and I'm fortunate to also be African American, to help and make sense of all this from, like I said before, a cultural perspective, a social perspective, but also a spiritual perspective, because we need people that they trust. There has been so much in this community, with them not trusting helpers, with African Americans and other people groups and people of color groups needing assistance and needing help and having been taken advantage of. So I absolutely get it. But then I'm also here in the court as a representative of the community to let them know that it's okay. I acknowledge what you've experienced. Here's the information, here's the education, but now it's time for application, meaning change.
I'm excited also to see that we have other psychologists, sociologists in our audience. I mentioned that the St. Louis County Courts, family courts, has been a big help to us in this conversation. Alfonso Ivy, Dr. Summer Johnson, and Alfonso is here, and he has put into the chat. Alfonso, would you just elaborate on the comment that you've made, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sound is good. Okay, well, I didn't want to take too much because I want Dr. Peoples to go ahead, but I was just adding to really what she was saying, adding some data, just my version of moderating, saying, I would say, putting it in my own words, trauma can pass on from generation to generation. And I know sometimes we say things like that in the church, but there's a biological or scientific data to back that. And a lot of times it has to do with attachment. It has to do with the relationship or the parenting abilities. And so if a parent has been affected by trauma, then they have some voids or some things that are missing. They're not equipped with everything that they need to be equipped with. And so some of those things pass down to the child. One example may be if I haven't received love or I don't know how to hug, then as a father, I may pass down that to my son because I've never hugged him or I've never loved him. So just an actual example. But that's about all I wanted to just add that little part.
Now, you bring up a good point. If you would allow me, this was something else that I was thinking about as well. There's some research into health, right? And what they've discovered is, like Alfonso was mentioning before, the biological aspect of trauma. They looked at adults, and what they found, and this goes to what I sent Liz, and you can maybe pull this up, Liz, if you want, the Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire. What they've discovered is people in their early childhood, as they've grown into adults, there are long-term health consequences of experiencing trauma, with some of them being stress, high blood pressure, and then also add to that, when you're stressed out, when you're experiencing a problem, that may lead you to drinking, that may lead you to smoking cigarettes. And I have this survey on screen, and this is something for the audience to look at and consider, because we're talking about community violence, and you may be saying to yourself, well, I come from a good background, I come from a good neighborhood, that doesn't apply to me, right? But no, this applies to you. Let's look at some of these questions, right? The questions: have you in your childhood ever felt like you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to take care or protect you? Or people also don't consider this when we're talking about trauma. Divorce. Did you lose a parent through divorce, abandonment, death? Did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? Live with someone on prescription drugs? Did your parents ever hit you? Or here's the key: did you live with someone who went to jail or prison? Did a parent ever swear at you, insult you, put you down? Okay, you see where I'm going with these questions. And when you score them, that gives you an idea about your background. The questions are there for all of us to develop the insight and realize that trauma is more widespread. This impacts every one of us. And if it's impacting us, it is also impacting these children that we serve who have experienced these things, in addition to some of the other extreme forms of trauma, with there being community violence, bullying, and other things like that. So this really hit home for me. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. You hold that in. Without treatment, you hold in the stress, you hold in the anxiety, you hold in the depression. And since we're looking at these questions, maybe this is a point of reflection for those in the audience. How many of you come to work holding that in? When you are working with a child who's experienced some sort of abuse, and maybe in your background you have abuse or neglect, have you been helped? Have you had therapy? Have you considered how that impacts how you show up at work and help others, other kids, other families who have experienced what you have also experienced as well? This also helps me with my empathy, because just to be completely honest, in this line of work, not everybody's nice. I've been cursed out over the phone, of treated poorly by parents and kids. But then when I take a step back and I realize, Brandy, look at what they've grown up in. Look at what they're currently living in. And you're the person calling and asking about an appointment after they have maybe been kicked out of their homes, after they've had to take off from work to deal with a child who is misbehaving. I'm that one person. And if I have to kind of get a mouthful, and then after that conversation, I understand, I'm here, and just proceed with being pleasant and calm, I can deal with it. Because this is what I know I'm dealing with. And ultimately, like I said, I want to be that consistent change agent. So after they've kind of finished with their rant, I can ask the question, tell me what you've been through. How is that impacting you? Because I hear it in your voice. And if I hear it in your voice and we're just talking on the phone to make an appointment, imagine how that shows up in your parenting. Imagine how that shows up behind closed doors. And imagine how that is impacting your child, who for the most part, I've seen mostly, at least within these last couple of years, tampering, assault. You know, I can just kind of go back into a case that I remember of a kid that I worked with several years ago. And he had experienced extreme sexual abuse. And he said something to me. And he also had been referred to the court for tampering, stealing cars and whatnot. He said to me, when I steal cars or attempt to steal cars, that's the only thing that keeps the sexual abuse off my mind. So he was having the repeated thoughts that were triggering him. And in turn, the only thing he could think of to do at his age and his development and with his resources is, I need to engage in something risky to get that off my mind. But he also talked about liking roller coaster rides. He also talked about like video games. See, these are high risk activities where you can kind of separate. He also talked about using marijuana. This is something that you can do to kind of separate from what's going on internally. So when we're working with our children and we see, and I talk a lot of marijuana abuse, you know, and they say, I need this to deal with stress. I need this to cope. I need this to get throughout my day. These are 15-year-olds, no bills, you know, no major responsibilities like that of an adult. But they're experiencing a world completely that's filled with a lot of stress, which is what has leading them to substance abuse and also engaging in high risk activities. I'm talking a lot, Dr. Simmons. I just want to know what you're thinking. You're on mute. I cannot hear you. Go ahead.
I was saying this is phenomenal. I'm anxious also to see if there are others in the audience who are as excited about this knowledge as I am. But one question that I would have is, how appropriate would it be to have this particular assessment available during intake?
You know what? It depends. I think when I think about counseling and intakes, I think this right here is something that you can ask, whether you provide this form formally or you just kind of ask informally, which is what I do. These questions are a part of my intake. I want to know what the social life is like. I want to know what your family life is like. And these are all questions that I ask. It's just in this formal document that I'm sure others could use as well. This was something that I found on the internet, so it's available and open for use.
I also wondered, because I've had experience with a number of the courts, St. Louis County, St. Louis City, Kansas City, and it's such a wonderful array of professionals. How do we provide these services across the state through all of the units, the entities that would be a part of federal programs, such as the county, city courts? Do we provide this kind of professional service and have people such as yourselves and Ivy and Dr. Summer Johnson available? Is this a common thing, or is this something unique to certain courts?
Well, I'm only familiar with St. Louis City and County, and to my understanding, yes. So I can speak only to that particular, these particular circuits. But from this discussion, we see the value and having people that are informed. And I think ultimately what we're talking about is trauma informed. care, trauma-informed assessments. Some people don't want to consider trauma. Some people say that it's an excuse for juvenile offenders. You know, and my thought to that is, I don't think this is an excuse. There should still be accountability. There should still be consequences. But as my role as a psychologist and others on the line that are therapists in the similar professions, I'm not just interested in the what, I'm interested in the why. Because we can figure the what out and there can be consequences for the what. But if we haven't attacked or addressed the root, which is the why, they keep coming back. So my role really with these types of questions, with me digging, with me establishing a relationship with families and other folks in the community, is trying to figure out why. And if I can educate families and kids on the why, they play a part in their own personal narrative of change.
I see that Cheryl from Greene County has said that they have some services available. And we also have a visitor from New Jersey, Naja Simmons Washington. And so if we'd like to hear what are some possible services that they may be familiar with in relationship to what you have shared. Cheryl, and then Naja, if you'd like to speak, I'd welcome that too.
Sure. In Greene County, we have a clinical services coordinator who helps come up with, we used to call them treatment plans, but I believe they're called case plans now, for juveniles who are placed on formal supervision. And then they check in every, I think it's every either 30 or 90 days, just depending on the needs of that youth, to see that the goals are being met and if there are changes in it, whether that be changes into now maybe there's a substance use issue that's going on that wasn't happening before, or there's different mental health issues going on that need attention. They meet the juvenile officers meet regularly with the clinical services coordinator to discuss those things and make sure we're at least connecting them to right resources in the community if we can.
Thank you for sharing, Ms. Davis. Ms. Washington, do you have any comments to share? Some input from New Jersey? She's muted there. Hopefully we can get her on. She's from, I think, the district attorney's office in Viston, as someone who will be a future speaker for us in this area. It's some of your conversation about generational trauma. If you would, how does that compare? Are you familiar with the epigenetic trauma that's been talked about from the studies that were done on the survivors of the Holocaust and the generations who have inherited some of that trauma psychologically?
Oh, I see a hand, Rick, if you.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Peoples. I do have a question. You know, we see a lot of more serious cases, of course, through our detention center. And, you know, some of these kids, of course, are on the certification docket. And I'm just curious as to, you know, when we look at the statute that talks about the 10 criteria that we have to investigate or report on in our social report to the judge, it doesn't mention anything that you talked about. You know, the closest thing I've seen is this, you know, the sophistication and maturity of the child as determined by consideration of his or her home and environment situation, emotional condition, and pattern of living. I think what you just talked about, to me, is a big factor to consider whether or not a child is suited for the juvenile system or the adult system. And so I'm just wondering, from your position, you know, how do we highlight some of that when we're talking about these serious decisions to be made on these kids who might be making some of these, committing some of these serious alleged offenses?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll get back to your question, Dr. Simmons, because I did remember a little bit about the information about the Holocaust. But going back to what you said, Mr. Gaines, essentially, I think that's the piece where everybody, all hands on deck, because everybody brings a unique position and a new, unique worldview. So here, just in this conversation, the piece of me being able to kind of more so have a relationship with the family, talk to family members to get a picture of what that looks like, that can ultimately explain what are they doing, how this child, and I also, with that being said, some of these kids kind of are repeat offenders. There is a culture of violence embedded within this generational trauma. There is a culture of gun violence. And then I also kind of mentioned how social media plays into all of this. So being able to have different people from different perspectives and disciplines to be able to add their piece to get a better picture of what this child looks like. It's really almost just art. I bring my tools and I paint a little bit, you bring your tools and you paint a little bit, and ultimately we're just trying to get a picture of this kid so we can help him or her, but also provide a piece of information to the family. Because even in these certification cases, from my experience, some of this is like brand new to family members who think, hey, since we're just kind of talking about generational trauma, who think that's not a big deal. Every man in this family goes to jail.
Right.
We need to interrupt that. So we need to interrupt that with education, and also, and I know everybody's role is very specific. So there are some questions and things that I can do that maybe other attorneys and other individuals involved can't. But that's what I think about, everybody bringing their piece to the table to get a better understanding and picture of the child within the framework of his community, her household, his household. And then we kind of move forward going with that piece of information.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just thinking that. Yeah, you did. And I'm thinking, in the bigger picture of scheming, with legislation, because this is legislation, how do we include that piece in part of these 10 factors more specific to these decisions? Because I think that's plays a big part in not just trying to look at the more higher end, like the seriousness of the offense, the viciousness of the offense, and because I think that piece is critical, that is missing specifically in the statute. And I'll work with Marsha Hazelhorst on that and see what we might be able to do in the legislative piece on that specific topic. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if I saw something else or saw something in the chat, or I didn't want to address that before moving forward. No. But the piece that I definitely want to elaborate on, and I use that word culture. I think some of the difficulties that I've seen in this work is that we are coming up against a culture in which these kids, these families, what they're doing is appropriate. It's a rite of passage. I think maybe that's a better word for some instances. This is a rite of passage. And I'm here to basically like disrupt that system. And that's where you get a lot of pushback. I have worked with kids who have extreme issues with guns, and I'm trying to provide education on that piece. But then when I kind of do a backtrack, the parents also, they accept. So who am I, this stranger at this one point in time, to provide this one piece of education when all they're growing up, they're raising, they have been told this is appropriate?
I understand exactly what you're saying about that part of a culture. The thing that I would be concerned about is, where do people separate culture from racialized events that brought that about? Because so often media and everything else will influence a certain type of characteristic that has become associated by race. And so when we talk about culture, we don't want to confuse it with the racial part of it without looking at
Absolutely.
generational, historical factors that presented this, so that
Absolutely.
people are not confused and say, oh, this is just something in the part of the culture of people who are of color.
Absolutely. And that goes back to institutionalized racism. When they consider lump everybody in the pool, like this is their culture, this is the culture, everyone kind of gets lumped into that same kind of category. But the piece that I'll add is that there are subsets of culture.
Yeah.
With these kids, that is a subset of culture. You know, that just because I'm Black, that doesn't mean I get it. There's a subset of culture. There's this emerging culture, you know. So I think it's important for us as individuals, as helpers, as educated folk, to be able to draw the line to say, okay, this is that, but that is that, and here is where I stay. This is what I understand. You know, I like to be optimistic and think that media would get it, but based upon how things are looking now, I don't think the design of the system is, it's easier to label them and us. It's
Yeah,
easier to
it's more
point the problem.
profitable.
Right. It's easier to say, well, that's them and we're over there. You know, it requires a great amount of nuance and consideration and empathy to be able to say these are the subsets of culture that have emerged because of Jim Crow, institutionalized racism, of lack of equity, of lack of resources, particularly education. That's a level I wish I had the answer in this 1 hour lunch and learn, but I think it's so important for us to just to start to have the conversation, to develop the insight, to start educating ourselves. So when we are faced with a case, when we see this kid, you know, I don't look at it well, just because I'm Black, I get it, because I don't. I want to be uniquely familiar with this kid's culture. And my familiarity with the culture helps me to better address the concerns with what's going on with them.
I agree. And it's important that we understand the intersection between generational trauma, historical trauma. You spoke earlier in informal conversation about the various phases or the various types of post-traumatic stress syndrome that have come about because of the historical events in America, from post-slavery to Jim Crow stress syndrome to the current part, social and political. And I put that in red here. Anti-Semitism is one possibility. And then looking at social or political persecution, including police profiling. And so what happens to a child who was born and experienced Trayvon Martin, Brown, just the series of that. What as a Black boy in America has been put upon you subliminally, subculturally, unconsciously about being a Black boy in America?
Absolutely.
That's a traumatic experience within itself.
Absolutely. And with that, there are the individual traumas that youth would experience, but then also the collective trauma of Mike Brown, the collective trauma, you know, and I said the word numbing earlier. I think we've all gotten somewhat numb to it. It was a point in which I was watching CNN and just kind of think about this, seeing a death on CNN and watching this like this is a regular part of the news, from the Mike Browns to all the other, you know, and I can't even name them all. You see this. And this is how I process this as an adult, with information, with understanding, with awareness. Imagine a child in that community. How do they process that? What do they hold, knowing that at any point when they leave their home, that might potentially be them? Or for some of the youth here, you know, when I do my assessments, I discover some of these high profile crimes that we see on the news. This is somebody that they know. So now they're coming to the detention center for their own kind of individual issue. but also holding in the fact that that person, you know, that was my friend that got killed. That was my cousin that got killed. These are all the collective traumas that they are experiencing. And kind of going back, and I know you brought up some things with the Holocaust, and I think this kind of fits in as well. There's a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGraw. I think that's pronounced accurately. But essentially, in summary, she is saying that as a cultural group, racial groups, you experience something collectively. And you experience something like the Holocaust or slavery collectively that kind of but impacts you on those different levels that we talked about earlier, the biological level, the social level, the spiritual, the mental, and the emotional level. That in turn impacts your stress levels. That in turn impacts your functioning moving forward. So you're no longer parenting from a healthy perspective. You're parenting from an unhealthy perspective because your parents parent you under stress. You were the recipient of that stress. So now you think stress is okay because that's what you experienced in your home. And then in turn, you parent from a stressful perspective because you model, you know, what you experienced and what you learned. So that's how those type of collective traumas impact us. And then we can also kind of talk about the identity issues. And I think that's where you were going as well, Dr. Simmons. With those collective traumas, particularly around persecution and police officers and whatnot, what does that say? Who am I? Am I less of a man? Am I less of a person? Because I'm being treated poorly. And not just me, everybody in my neighborhood is being treated poorly, you know, and then they come to detention, they come to detainment with this very negative concept. And I dare not even go into the details of what some of these children have said to me of how they don't see themselves living beyond 22 years old. Or going to jail is not a big deal. Everybody in my family is going to jail. Or they refer to themselves in derogatory terms, less than a man. And I think that's because of the environment that they've grown up in. And when I say environment, think beyond house. Think beyond house. Think about community. And now, and I mentioned social media before, we have to consider that. Because with parents being more absent than they are present for various reasons, the internet has now become like the parent. They are engaged in social media trends that are, in my opinion, very negative on a 24/7 basis with no filter, with no limitations or boundaries. That has infiltrated the home and in turn infiltrated the community. And I think in some instances that can explain what we see when they come to detention. So yeah.
This has been phenomenal. And at this point, if you will agree, Dr. Peoples, I'd like for us to open up the floor to hear from some of our participants too. And so just if you have something to share, just unmute your mic and speak out.
This is Rick again, Dr. Peoples. And as I've heard you speak, and we really work well, especially our kids who come through detention. And I'm just wondering, as I see a lot of these even cases in the news, when they talk about, when a person snaps, if you will, and do some, some of the mass shootings, some of the more violent crimes, they always talk about, oh, that person has had a mental health situation. It maybe not been, the family says, mental health situation, never been treated, or they weren't taking their treatment process, but they never talk about the traumatic piece in regards to how those adults who get to that point, or even kids, they never talk about, when you talk about that community trauma, because we see it for sure up here. But I'm just wondering, at some point, how do we, as a juvenile court, start talking about in making some of this traumatic experience for these people and moving into the adult world, how do we start talking about that to where it gets the notices that it should get, and not wait till everybody says, oh, he has mental health that were never treated, or things like that. I'm just curious from your seat how that might, how we could try to start addressing some of that.
Well, I think conversations like today, it's a great start, because when we start addressing that, we have to think about that from two different perspectives. How do we address this as clinicians? How do we address this as professionals? It starts with education. When I sit down with that kid, there are some things that I want to know that I'm able to detail when I'm asking questions and trying to figure that out. When I present and go to a staffing, I bring that information with me. That is me kind of digging deep to get a better picture and understanding of not just the what, but the why. And I think it would be important for other people in the community to consider what things truly look like. I want to be positive about this. I really, really, really do. But mental health funding is incredibly low in Missouri. If we had more research sources, if there weren't as much of a stigma, I think there would be more people on board that would be willing to address the root of the issue. And that's kind of what I hear you saying, Mr. Grants, in the beginning, then in the tail end. Because that's what I hear is a lot of people kind of jumping after something is done. But if there were mental health funding, if there were more community programs, if people were willing to ask about how is your mental health, just like they ask, hey, how are you feeling today? People don't have a problem with saying, well, I'm not feeling well. Okay, we'll take a Tylenol, take an aspirin. But for some reason, there's this stigma around mental health where if I admit to not feeling well, there's some type of personal deficit, I'm broken, I'm not good enough. And I think ultimately, like I said before, it starts there with the education piece. When we start to recognize that mental health and physical health go hand in hand, and if I were to go even deeper, your mind controls your body. So if my mind is messed up, my body in some ways will respond. So I think the funding piece, the education piece is what's missing. But fortunately, on this end and being a part of a treatment court, we get the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper and not just apply consequences, not just kind of lay out sentences, but be able to say to parents and other community of persons involved, like, this is what's going on in this community. If we don't address this community, we're just going to kids are going to keep coming out and reoffending because they are products of the community.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I need to bring you along with some of these town hall meetings I'm going to.
Oh, like I said, a part of the solution is really money, and I could just sit here and just talk all day. It bewilders me that we have money for everything else, but when it comes down to boots on the ground, for money to help people, the people that are helping people get paid the less. And there's no money for services, no money for like social improvement, but there's always money for everything else.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I had retrieved some of the statistics for Missouri. You're speaking of the funding and looking at even the schools, what's provided for professional counseling in the schools. And it seems that in most of the schools in Missouri, the caseloads of psychologists and social workers is extremely high. It's rated high comparatively to national stats, yet it's much higher when it comes to police and security in the schools. There is more money, there's more presence of policemen than of psychologists, sociologists, social workers. And so we provided those stats a couple of weeks ago to the Missouri Social Workers Association through a project, I think through RED. So that's, I'm pretty much echoing the agreement that we're not putting the funds there. And I'm with Mr. Gaines that
Mm.
this is something that we need to begin to advocate more for.
Absolutely.
I saw that Teresa had muted a minute ago from the Kansas City courts. Is there anyone, Teresa, you have comments, and we welcome you all to share while we've got these few minutes left.
Well, I do think that there are people on the call from Kansas City or Jackson County that are far more knowledgeable of the assessment process for our youth when they come into our facilities. One of my great concerns every single day is the trauma, maybe secondhand, I don't know, trauma that my colleagues experience. I talked to many of my colleagues that are in the fields, supervising youth, that are dealing with youth being shot, harmed, killed every single day. And yet I'm trying to advocate for the family court to take that into consideration and to develop some kind of resource for my colleagues that are suffering from that trauma, and then every day expected to go out and provide hope and services to our youth when they're broken and they're hurt, and like they're starting their day in tears learning about a kid that was shot and killed the previous night that they have a relationship with. And I'm wondering, for one thing, is what's out there to provide services for our staff that work in the juvenile justice system, that are going through the trauma of losing people that they are working with every single day. That's one major thing for me. And the second thing for us is in Kansas City, the gun culture. And we as a family court take a position that if you come to our attention with a weapon involved, we're going to detain you. So there goes our red numbers out the door right there, because in Jackson County, only Black youth carry weapons. And so our disparities for incarcerating our youth are greater because we take a strong position against weapons. Yet it seems to me like there's just this gun culture out there, and we do nothing. When we bring you into detention and you have had a weapon, we don't provide anything for you. When we place you under our supervision and you have a weapon for an offense involving a weapon, we have no services to offer you for that. When we incarcerate you or place you in our treatment programs, we don't address the gun violence, but we keep locking them up. And again, there goes our red numbers because they're all Black youth.
Wow. Well, if I can address your first question first, and the one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about staff, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this too much, but vicarious trauma. Working with people that have been traumatized, you in turn can internalize some of that trauma, and that impacts you, which brings about stress, fatigue, burnout. My recommendation for staff members would be EAP, of course, but also be willing to see a therapist yourself. I think for many of us, there's a level of pride, there's some ego, or just lack of information. Go out for therapy groups, support groups, even if that is talking to your colleagues, at work, after work, dinners. We all need to be able to vent with supportive groups, which research shows that if you're linked up with a supportive group, supportive organization, that helps you in the long term. So that's the first piece. The second piece, I know here we do have some follow-up classes, some educational classes about gun violence and how that impacts the individual, but also the system in the community. I think more education is needed, but here's this pessimistic part of me. For every class, for every piece of education, there's a TikTok, there's a Snapchat, there's an Instagram, there's a rapper, in a video on YouTube that's posting videos about guns. I honestly wish I had the answer to that. My fantasy answer would be, let's get some of these famous rappers, at these facilities, these are the ones the kids are modeling. Let's get some of them here so they can really talk about the detrimental effects of gun violence. Because what I've discovered is the music that they're producing, they don't let their children listen to. Mm-hmm. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Us in Jackson County, there are people out there in our community that have experienced this, that are wanting to deal with youth we won't accept them because they're not posted as a best practice someplace. You know, they're not on somebody's website as a best practice. So we won't allow people that have experienced it, that are out in the community saying, we want to help. You can't, Jackson County won't touch you.
And that's a shame. I know at least in substance abuse treatment, they have individuals who, you know, have been on substances and who have overcome. They are the ones teaching and training and helping. So maybe that same model needs to be used. Those that have been personally impacted by gun violence, the individuals from the community, you know, that can talk about what this is like. Because they may not listen to me, but they may listen to somebody else from their neighborhood, their hood, that understands and relates.
St. Louis County Courts, one of their presenters was in a similar role, who works with them, you know, with detained youth, and he shared his actual experiences. You know, Carol Parker has put in some information, and where she says that she's aware that many counselors and therapists have left practice because of excessive strain. And I think this goes back to what Ms. Smith from Kansas City Courts was referring to, the need for professional services there. Carol, before we turn it over to Liz to close out and see if there are any final comments from Dr. Peoples, did you have anything to add to that, Ms. Parker? That was Carol Parker Comer. Okay, so if not, then final words. We've got 3 minutes. Dr. Brandy and then Liz wants to talk about the evaluation forms. Or Liz, you want to do that first and then have Dr. Peoples to close out?
Sure. Thank you all for attending today. This was a great session. So I have put the link for the survey in the chat. Please go ahead and take that if you would. That is definitely helpful. I believe next month we're not going to have a lunchtime learning. We have the MJJA Fall Conference the 15th through the 17th. If you haven't signed up to attend that or registered, I believe the hotels are all maybe full and the discounted rate may be shut off, but you can still register to attend. And we have lots of RED sessions that'll be going on during that conference. And then we will be back to our lunchtime learning in June. And that is all I have.
Okay.
I did see one more question, Dr. Simmons, from Ms. Grimes. And I think her question was, is it appropriate to ask for trauma information and the psychological? Absolutely. I think if you are specifically concerned about traumatic symptoms as it relates to the kid that you're representing, you can definitely note that in your referral question and relay that to the DJL. But also, I'll also add that in my psychological assessments, if it's relevant for that child, I do a detailed traumatic history. And I also add that piece in my conceptualization, which ultimately explains my diagnosis, the bigger picture of that kid. So that was the one thing. And then the other piece, counselors are leaving because of the stress. I'll add into that teachers. I've been looking into a lot of different things. Teachers are also leaving the profession because they've had to deal with mental health and behavioral problems that they have not been trained to deal with in the classroom. And then my final piece will be just thank you very much. I really do hope, and this was a conversation, an informal conversation in which I want everyone on this line, wherever your reach is, to just start thinking about you as an individual, your personal traumatic histories, and then what you bring to the table, and how also you work with children, families, communities, so forth. So.
Thank you. This was phenomenal, phenomenal. Can we get a hand clap? She was wonderful. And a special thanks not only to Dr. Brandy Peoples, but to Mr. Rick Gaines. But we've been borrowing from his court some, and we appreciate that, just as we had Kansas City Court to do some sharing. We just are so grateful for your specialists and your professionals. And upcoming for our July virtual, you'll see Dr. Summer Johnson and Alfonso Ivy again coming in to share about psychological services, sociological services, and parenting. With that, goodbye and thank you for attending. Wonderful, Dr. Peoples.
Thank you.